talking to me. Jaguar, surely one of the most charismatic marques of all time in the history of motor racing. But you have to earn your reputation in competitive sport. And for Jaguar, that meant doing it on the world stage. And the world stage, for them, was the Le Mans 24-hour race. This is the XK120C, otherwise known as the C-Type. It won that great race for them twice, 1951 and again in 1953. But for the 1954 season, they had something else in mind. The XKD, otherwise known as the D-Type. Similar, but different. Well, this is the 1954 works car, or one of the three that they took to Le Mans that year. They didn't win the race in 1954, but for 1955, 1956 and 1957, they performed a hat-trick. And in 1957, not only did they come first, they also came second, third, fourth and sixth. And on the back of that success was born the great legend of Jaguar that is still felt today, over half a century later. Like many of the great motor manufacturers of the 20th century, whether it be Ford, Ferrari, Bugatti or Porsche, Jaguar was the vision and creation of one man, the son of a piano salesman from Blackpool in the north of England, William Lyons. He was just 21 years of age when he started his company and would build Jaguar into a worldwide concern over the next half a century. William Lyons started up in business just after World War I, making sidecar bodies for motorcycles. It was called the Swallow Sidecar Company. It wasn't long before they go on to making Swallow bodies for cars, like Austin Sevens and Wolseleys. But of course, what Lyons really wanted was to make his own cars from start to finish. In the early 1930s, he kicked off with the first SS car, which was a saloon car. It didn't take him long to get on to very tasty little two-seater roadsters. William Lyons' first sports car offering was called the SS90. It got replaced fairly early on by the first SS100. Now that had a 2.5 litre engine and they sold quite a few of them, which encouraged him to then
get a 3.5-litre engine fitted to the car. Bill Haynes had joined the company in 1938. He redesigned the engine, and in it went. Well, it turned the car into a very lively performer indeed. This is one of the factory cars that was entered in the RAC Rally in 1939. There were 3 of them. They won their class, and this one actually came 8th overall and helped them win the team prize as well. It's a 6-cylinder overhead valve engine producing about 120 horsepower. This one's been tweaked up a bit. Twin SU carburetors there, and altogether a very reliable unit. This was the first car that really put Jaguar on the competition map, because people could buy these cars and go and race them or rally them, which of course gave William Larnes some great ideas for the future.
Jaguar founder William Larnes and his chief engineer Bill Haynes never really got the chance to fully develop their SS100 sports car before World War II broke out. Then immediately after the war, in 1945, Larnes was compelled to concentrate on his more lucrative volume saloon and sedan production models for survival. But his hankering to create an innovative flagship British sports car soon returned. He was about to launch his first masterpiece.
In the summer of 1948, Jaguar didn't even have a sports car in their production car lineup. But later that year at the London Motor Show, they launched this, the XK120 Roadster. And when I say it stormed the motoring world, I mean stormed. What made the XK120 so appealing to buyers wasn't so much just its totally gorgeous looks, but the overall package that offered great value for money. Jaguars had been working for some considerable time on their brand new engine, and when it first saw the light of day, it was very well received. There it is, the ubiquitous XK unit. 6 cylinders in a line, cast iron crankcase, aluminium cylinder head, twin overhead camshafts driven by chain, twin SU carburetors. One of the most successful road and racing engines of all time, with a lifespan of over 40 years. 160 horsepower in this trim, good enough to propel an XK120 to over 120 miles an hour, hence the name. Jaguar specially prepared 6 XK120s for chosen drivers, and Sterling Moss got his hands on this particular example for the Dundrod TT in 1950. Well, he won that race outright, a great international win for Jaguar, and of course it really helped to put Sterling himself on the map as the fantastic driver that he had become. William Larnes and Lofty England went to Le Mans in 1950. There were 3 private XKs entered. They didn't win, but they convinced Larnes that they could get great publicity from the Le Mans 24-hour race. So for the 1951 season, he commissioned new cars, C-types, to be built to try and win the race. A few months before that race, he thought, well, maybe they won't be ready in time. So he commissioned a couple of XK120 lightweights to be built. This is LT2, and the other one was LT3. It's got a one-piece magnesium body, stretched over a lightweight tubular space frame, Superleggera technique. I think that's where Jaguar's got the idea from. Have a look at the back there. There's no boot either. It's got a huge 40-gallon petrol tank. This car was developed and tested especially for Le Mans, but it never went there. The C-types were ready in time, and they did the race in 1951, which they won, of course. Instead, Hornberg, the Los Angeles Jaguar dealer, saw the two lightweights at the factory, bought them, shipped them to California, and they had a pretty successful time racing in the States. Phil Hill told me years ago, if you ever get a chance to drive one of those LT cars, take it. They're quite something. That's what I'm about to find out. This LT2 is a surprising car. It's lower than the XK120, so it handles better, it turns in nicely. The brakes are surprisingly good for drum brakes. There's no doubt in my mind this would have made a great Le Mans car. Such a shame it couldn't have gone there in 1951. X-Works C-Type and the 120 Roadster and the LT2 is the steering, because on the C-Type it's rack and pinion, so it really is much more positive and turns in even better than the LT2. It's got disc brakes, of course, on this car, so it really stops a lot better, and the Weber carburetors really give you that punch out of the corners that you're looking for. The XK120 C-Type. This car was hardly out of its box in 1951 when Jaguar decided to take it to the 24-hour race at Le Mans. It won outright. That was quite magnificent for Jaguar because it meant they could then set up a small production run and actually start selling these cars to privateers who would go all over the world extolling the virtue of Jaguar wherever they went. This particular car is a later model. They modified it quite considerably over the years, tuning up the engine, fitting the Weber carburetors, changing camshafts, little things, but little things that made it more reliable. When they went back to Le Mans in 1953, they won that race again. Perhaps the biggest difference, apart from all those tune-ups, was the fact that the car that won the race that year had disc brakes fitted to it. Now that's the first time in history that a car had won the 24-hour race on disc brakes, and it created a precedent that everyone else would have to catch up to. No sooner had Jaguar started having successes with its XK engine cars than people started wondering about the engine. Perhaps if they fitted one of those engines to one of their cars, they might get quite a good result. The HWM Motor Company was based down in Walton-upon-Thames, which is just south of London. George Abacassis and John Heath were the proprietors, and they'd been racing a Formula 2 car fitted with a 4-cylinder 2-litre Alta engine. They decided they'd like to put an XK engine into their car. The difficulty was finding an engine, because the factory were a bit reluctant to sell them singly. They needed everyone they could find to go into a car. Well, they bought a wreck, an XK120, took the engine out and shoehorned it into here. What's interesting, actually, is that HWM developed quite a relationship with Jaguar and were able to do a lot of development testing for them on those Weber carburetors. This car was really built for Formula Libre races in Great Britain. It was fairly successful, but what it did teach everybody else was that if you wanted to, you could get an XK engine and fit it into your car. Now that gave a lot of people a lot of bright ideas. The D-Type was always a very, very special car. Back in 1954, Jaguars wouldn't sell you one of these unless you could convince them that you were going to race it. It had a monocoque centre chassis rather than a tubular space frame like the C-Type. Malcolm Sayer, their brilliant aerodynamicist, designed the body, did the C-Type as well, but this car was particularly slippery. At Le Mans in 1954, Stirling Moss amazed everybody by clocking very nearly 173 miles an hour down the Mulsanne Straight. That was the fastest anyone had ever been at that time. The three works cars in 54 were registered OKV 1, 2 and 3. This is number 2. The KV, of course, is Coventry's registration, where they were built. Let's see what's under the bonnet, shall we? Well, there it is, the XK engine. 6 cylinders, twin overhead camshaft. You've got these triple Weber carburetors over here, 1 choke per cylinder. That's a dry sump tank over there. They thought of just about everything. Aluminium radiator even. These engines produced anything from about 250 to maybe 270, 80 horsepower, depending on the spec and the camshafts. But when you look at this car today, it is just as desirable as it was back then. In fact, whereas you could get one of these cars for something under £2,000 in England and perhaps $10,000 in the States, today you cannot buy one of these works cars for love nor money.
Although the D-Type just failed to win Le Mans in 1954, Jaguar came back the next year with their long-nosed body and wide-angle cylinder head, and won the race against the backdrop of the worst accident in motor racing history. This would be the last factory win for the D-Type, although a private team would take the D to further triumphs. In the early 1950s, a small Scottish company based in Edinburgh, built a reputation in sports car racing. Its name? Écurie Écosse, run by David Murray. Initially, they ran cars for wealthy privateers. Their first effort was for Sir Ian Scott Douglas and his Jaguar XK120.
The rules for joining the Écurie Écosse were pretty simple. Buy a decent car and we'll run it for you, which is exactly what Sir Ian did with this XK120. The Écurie were so pleased with the results that both he and the car got, they purchased 2 more of them to go racing. Of course, they went on to bigger and better things with C-types and D-types, and of course achieved those elusive wins at the 24 Hours of Le Mans, the most important race in the world for them and just about everybody else. Isn't this a wonderful colour, by the way? Écurie Écosse blue. You'd be surprised how many people have their new cars painted this colour. Jaguar soon realised how important Le Mans was for their marketing plan. It was really quite simple. When they won Le Mans in 1955, they sold more cars. For the 1956 season, they built 6 brand new Jaguar D-type long-nose cars. They started off rather badly at the beginning of the season, but they did win the last 12-hour race, which kind of got morale up a bit. Let's have a look inside here, shall we? The engine had been breathed on for the 56 season. They altered the valve angle, creating what we now know as the wide-angle head. And just look at those lovely trumpets over here on those Weber carburetors. Don't they look great? And of course, the whole of the subframe bolted to the monocoque, which is what makes up a D-type. The thing about Le Mans, it's all about straight line speed and the ability to be able to brake. Although, in the 1956 race, unfortunately, the 2 factory cars that they thought might do well both went out. I think it was on the 2nd lap. But nevertheless, their staunch supporter, that fabulous privateer team, Écurie Écosse, came through for them and won that race. Well, at the end of 1956, Jaguar decided that they'd had enough of racing as a factory team. They'd done all the R&D that they needed on the cars, so they decided to sell them. Écurie Écosse bought another couple of them, and when they went to Le Mans in 1957, guess what? Well, they won it again, 2nd year running, and they came 2nd as well. This is the car that came 2nd at Le Mans in 1957, and it's in very much the same state today as it was then. It gets raced regularly in vintage sports car events today, and just look at it. I mean, it is one of the most beautiful cars ever designed and built in England. You can't get your hands on one of these to save your life, I can tell you. So it's been a great joy for me to be able to drive it. Such are the vagaries of fate that although I was really happy driving the car that came 2nd at Le Mans in 1957, that Écurie Écosse long-nosed D-type,
a chance has arisen to drive a Le Mans winner. This is XKD 501, the short-nose car that won the Le Mans 24-hour race in 1956. Drivers Ninian Sanderson and Ron Flockhart. It's really just a basic cooking XKD Jag. It started life in May 1955 when it was delivered to the Edinburgh-based team. They raced it in 1955, won the last 12-hour race in 1956, and then the 24-hour race at Le Mans. 3 twin-choke Weber carburetors, twin overhead camshaft engine, 3.4 litres, single plug per cylinder. It's got the monocoque, it's got the square tube subframe at the front, and basically just a really well-prepared standard car. But what makes this car so very special is the very simple fact it stayed in the ownership of one of Ecos's sponsors until he died in 1970. And then it was sold to a Scottish businessman. Now, he kept it in his collection, just doing a few simple road events for 30 years. And then it got sold again, so now this car is on its 3rd owner. If you want an example of a definitive Le Mans winning D-type, this has to be it. The body, the chassis, the frame, the engine, gearbox, wheels, suspension, the whole car is complete and utterly original. And I'm very pleased to say I'm going to give it a little road test to see how it differs, if it does, from the long-nose car. You know if there is any difference between a long-nose and a short-nose D-type Jag? In this Targa Florio Nürburgring-like surrounding, I can't tell what it is. I guess I'll have to take them both to the Mulsanne Straight at Le Mans to find out. But that, of course, is for another day.
Sir William Lance was a very hands-on boss at Jaguar, worked in close cooperation with Malcolm Sayre and others in the design staff. He loved those long-nosed D-types of 1957, so it's hardly surprising that his new series of road cars would bear considerable resemblance. But when the E-type first saw the light of day at the Geneva Motor Show of 1961, it literally caused a sensation. This car I'm driving is chassis 003. It's the very oldest of the flat-floor open roadsters. And if you're wondering what happened to chassis 001 and 002, they were crushed.
As privileged as I am to drive the oldest surviving E-type, it's also a real kick to be behind the wheel of the very first E to win a race.
Hardly had the E-type made its first public appearance at the Geneva Motor Show early in 1961 that everybody wanted to get their hands on one. And not necessarily just for use on the streets. Racers took one look at this car and wanted to put it on the track. English Jaguar dealer John Coombs from Guildford, just south of London, took one of his very first production E-type roadsters, tickled it up a bit, entered it into a race at Alton Park for Roy Salvadori to drive. It was registered BUY1. Equip Endeavour took this car, chassis 005, registered ECD 400, and entered it in the same race up at Alton Park. Well, they had a great fight with each other, beating the Ferraris and the Aston Martins. Roy Salvadori came second. ECD 400 won the first race for an E-Type at Alton Park on that day. The driver, the late, great Graham Hill, who of course went on to become Formula One world champion in 1962. But this is basically just a showroom stock, flat floor, Series 1 E-Type Roadster. Nothing more, nothing less. Very, very few modifications. Even the original dashboard, original leather seats. It is, however, an amazing car. And Graham Hill, of course, remarkable driver. After the Jaguar factory packed up racing in 1956 and disposed of their wonderful long-nosed D-types, they had a strange problem. They had a lot of monocoque subframes, engines and gearboxes left over. They didn't know what to do with them. Well, they created the XKSS, the road-going D-type. Put a windscreen on it, side screens, short nose rather than long nose, and this became a very desirable road car. Problem was, in 1957, had a terrible fire just after Christmas. It destroyed most of the stock, and only about 16 of these cars actually got built. Meantime, the E-Type development program is well underway. This is known as E2A, Experimental Car Number 2, A for aluminium. It's got a monocoque, subframes. The biggest difference, though, between the E-Type prototype and the D-Type was the back end. There's an independent suspension in there, made an awful lot of difference, gave this car some really attractive road holding. The factory were thinking about racing this car in 1958 at Le Mans. In fact, it didn't go. But in 1960, somehow, Briggs Cunningham managed to extract this car from them, fitted with a 3-litre engine, and it went to Le Mans. Qualified beautifully. Unfortunately, after 9 or 10 hours, it expired, which is really rather a shame. But it's still alive and cooking today. It eventually got fitted with a 3.8-litre engine, got sent back to America, and Walt Hansigan actually won a race with it. But Jack Brabham, when he drove it, wasn't able to do very well. What Jaguars needed for racing, seriously, was a lightweight version of their E-Type. This is the first Cunningham lightweight E-Type. It's 500 pounds less in weight than a standard car. What were the differences? Well, it's got a 3.8-litre wide-angle head engine, but look at those trumpets there. That is Lucas fuel injection. The slides are in there. It's got the dry sump tank, of course. The monocoque was aluminium, and lots of lightweight parts all over the place. They also fitted a ZF 5-speed gearbox. But even though they managed to get the weight of this car down by some 500 pounds, it still, in its day, wasn't a particularly competitive car. That was the problem with it. It just didn't have enough power, and it just didn't handle well enough. However, today, things are slightly different. If you go to a good vintage sports car race, well, like the TT at Goodwood, for instance, it's the lightweight E-Types that do best. They've really come on in leaps and bounds in the last 30-odd years. Meanwhile, back at Jaguar, they never resisted a good development program. And Malcolm Sayer, to try to get the drag down on the regular lightweight E-Type, produced this gorgeous-looking low-drag coupe. Have a good look at this car. It's truly about as beautiful as an E-Type got, and as aerodynamic as one got as well. But unfortunately, even it wasn't competitive then. But you wait till you see one of these cars racing today. Brian Lister had built some really spectacular Jaguar engine sports cars during the 1950s. But when his favourite driver, Archie Scott Brown, who'd been a Connaught Grand Prix driver, was killed in one of his cars, he really lost heart and decided he'd had enough of motor racing, put the company up for sale. But he'd already commissioned a gentleman called Frank Costin to design him a new Lister car that would be different, radically different from his original cars. Instead of having a ladder chassis, it would have a full tubular space frame. However, he didn't know what to do with the car when it was built. And eventually, Peter Lumsden and Peter Sargent, who badly crashed their lightweight E-Type at the Nürburgring in 1962, bought the car with a view to entering it at Le Mans in 1963. They had the car bodied with this rather pretty GT body that you see on it now. This is the actual car that they took to Le Mans in 1963. The heart of it lies under here. It's got this tubular space frame that you can see, very lightweight. This is a full lightweight E-Type engine. It's got an aluminium cylinder block, which you can see under there. It's got a wide-angle cylinder head. Lucas fuel injection, gives about 300 and odd horsepower in a car that weighs under a ton. So this machine has got a real performance to it. Unfortunately though, it didn't do very good at Le Mans in 1963 at all. And it only ever did one other race, the Nürburgring 1,000 kilometers. Didn't do very well there either. But the important thing is that it was an association with Jaguar, and it was a chance for Jaguar to go back to Le Mans fairly late in that XK six-cylinder engine's life. Beautiful looking car, really lovely to drive too. And this is the only one that they ever built. The 1950s had been good for Jaguar, very good indeed. 5 outright victories at the prestigious Le Mans 24-hour race, including a hat-trick in 1955, 56 and 57. But what might they do for the future if they were to win that Le Mans 24-hour race? The E-Type program produced the most fantastic street cars, but unfortunately not a car that could win at Le Mans. In 1963, they'd purchased the old Coventry Climax Engine Company and inherited 2 fantastic engineers, Walter Hassan and Harry Mundy. They designed and built the Climax engines that had done so well in Grand Prix racing in 1961 and 1962. Their first brief for Jaguar was to design an all-new V12 engine for a would-be prototype. This is it, sitting right here in the XJ13, which was designed by aerodynamicist Malcolm Sayer. Let's have a look at this engine. It's really 2 XK six-cylinder cylinder heads sitting on a common crankcase. They've got downstream injection, Lucas metering unit here, 12-cylinder distributor, electronic ignition. Very state-of-the-art for the time. 5-litre capacity, producing something just over 500 horsepower. Well, with a bit of luck. Norman Dewis was the test driver for Jaguar, and they built this car in the experimental shop and took it to Myra on more than one occasion. And the car was just starting to get broken in and do rather well for itself. Got up to about 180 miles an hour, in fact, when poor old Norman had the mother and father of accidents, and the car was extensively damaged. The FIA also dropped a bombshell on Jaguar because for 1967 they decided that prototypes would have an engine capacity maximum of 3 litres, and this was a 5-litre car. So even though it was rumoured 3 of these cars might have run at Le Mans in 1966, in actual fact they only ever built the one. It got extensively tested. It's a beautiful car, a great tribute to Malcolm Sayer. But what it really did is produce the concept of using a V12 engine in the E-Type Jaguar. And that's exactly what happened to the car. The engine was used for development purposes and the car lay around. But it's been rebuilt and here it is today, looking terrific. And I think I'm going to enjoy driving it.
By 1971, the E-Type had been in production for 10 years and sold like hotcakes around the world, with around 57,000 of them produced. Of those, 85% were exported. Jaguar management realized that if the car was to continue to sell, especially in the lucrative North American market, it needed a serious upgrade. So the Series 3 E-Type was introduced, and instead of the old 6-cylinder XK engine, a V12 appeared in a production Jaguar for the first time, a refined 5.3-litre unit, making it a much smoother car to drive. With the Series 3, they kept the E-Type going for 4 more years and sold plenty more of them. This car I'm driving, registration number HDU 555N, is the very last E-Type ever made.
Well, Jaguar definitely succeeded in making the V12 E-Type a very special car. It's got more than enough power at all speeds and in every gear. The steering's delightful too. I think they could be very pleased with themselves. I've really enjoyed driving it. But of course the story didn't end there. In 1974, racing driver Bob Tullius, who'd been operating the Group 44 racing team, mainly driving Triumphs and various other cars, convinced British Leyland, who owned Jaguar, that the V12 E-Type could still be competitive in Group B category of the Sports Car Club of America's racing series. Well, they decided to support both Tullius, Group 44, and Huffaker Engineering. That is the V12 5.3-litre engine, developing about 480 horsepower. It's got 4 of those Stromberg carburetors on it, single cam per bank of cylinders. Look at that distributor in the middle there. Wonderful big 12-plug distributor. But basically, this car is nothing more than a beefed-up version of the street car. But it was successful. In that first year, Huffaker Engineering, who were operating on the West Coast, won their first race. Bob Tullius went on to capture 7 outright track records in that year. That's 1974, and he didn't start until August. 1975, things went even better. Bob Tullius became the Group B national champion. And that really helped Jaguar's sales. And I'm told that this car handles really well and it's got a lot of grunt. So I think it's time to find that out, don't you?
As the E-Type came to the end of its life in 1975, Jaguar replaced it with the XJS Coupe, again V12 powered. Bob Tullius and Group 44 continued their race-winning ways with the XJS in the United States, twice taking the Trans Am Championship. And then it was the turn of Britain, Tom Walkinshaw and his TWR team, who, with full Jaguar factory support, won the prestigious European Touring Car Championship in 1984.
William Lyons, Jaguar's founder, always considered that success at the Le Mans 24-hour race was the very best way for him to demonstrate his company's products to the marketplace. This is our old friend, the D-Type from the 1957 Le Mans race, run for Jaguar then by Ecurie Cos. During the mid-1960s, the XJ13 was intended to be a Jaguar prototype at Le Mans. They entered 3 of them in the 66 race. Wonderful 4-cam engine in it, and just look at it, a beautiful car. At the end of the day, they only built the one, and it never raced. It wasn't till the late 1980s when, in partnership with Tom Walkinshaw and Tom Walkinshaw Racing, they built the XJR9. Tony Southgate designed this car. He'd worked in Grand Prix racing with BRM. He'd worked on the Ford C100 prototype. I worked there on it with him. And this was very much indeed a state-of-the-art car at that time. It's got a carbon fibre chassis. It's got excellent aerodynamics, a 7-litre V12 engine. They built 5 of these cars for the 1988 race. This one won the race outright for them. Another one came 4th. The rest of the places were filled by Porsches. I've always admired this car, and it's a great opportunity now, I think, to have a little drive in it, a little track test, and then we'll talk about it some more and have a look at that fabulous chassis and engine too. Oh, what a remarkable machine this is. I'm not surprised that this car won Le Mans. It's got everything that you want to have in a Le Mans car. A stiff chassis, fantastic brakes, and that engine. I've got to have a look at that engine. Don and Justin, I think I need a hand here to get the back off, please. It's got instant delivery, this car, in all the gears. You hit the throttle, you get response. And what's in here is responsible for that. Thanks very much. Well, there it is. That's a production Jaguar block there, basically, but with TWR cylinder heads on there. 7 litres capacity, 700 horsepower, and probably 650, 700 foot-pounds of torque, all for the time, state of the art, really. But the drivers preferred this single-cam engine, believe it or not. One of these cars was fitted with a 4-cam engine once. It won the only race it ever did at Brands Hatch, but because of the extra weight, all up high, the drivers preferred the single-cam engine. That's a March gearbox on there that got modified. Beautiful change. Here's the carbon fibre tunnels at the back here. That takes the air management under the car, transfers it into download. Beautiful quality welding. Just look at that exhaust system. Altogether, a very, very well-built car. And above all, it did the business for Jaguar, didn't it? It won the 24-hour race. You can't ask a car to do more than that.
In fact, an upgraded version of the XJR9, the XJR12, won Le Mans again in 1990, the 7th outright victory for Jaguar in this famous endurance classic.
During the 1980s, Jaguar had developed a very close working relationship with TWR, Tom Walkinshaw Racing. And they decided to go ahead and form a joint company that would build the most magnificent supercar. This is it, the XJ220. All the competition like Ferrari and Porsche were building these fantastic top-of-the-range cars, and Jaguar wanted to have one too. Initially, well, the prototype had a V12 4-cam engine, 4-wheel drive, all kinds of things. But eventually, when this car was actually released to the public in the early 1990s, it had a 3.6-litre V6 twin turbocharged engine, giving some 500 horsepower altogether in street-going trim and driving through its own specially produced 5-speed gearbox. The chassis was a pressed aluminium honeycomb construction, clothed in this very pretty all-aluminium body. So the car was actually immensely strong, and it handled really well too, because it actually had downforce with its tunnels underneath the car. There it is then. It's a 3.5-litre V6 engine. It's got a fuel management system, giving something around 550 horsepower in street trim. That's with 2 turbochargers, of course, and a 5-speed gearbox that was specially designed and built. Altogether, a very compact little unit. Because Jaguar had done so well at Le Mans with Tom Walkinshaw, 2 outright victories, let's not forget, they decided in 1993 that they'd go back to Le Mans, not perhaps to win it outright this time, but at least have a really good go in the GT category. So they built and entered 3 of these very special XJ220C, C for competition. It's still got that same aluminum honeycomb chassis, but this time they put carbon fibre body panels on it, which of course are removable, so you can get at all the bits and pieces. The engine was tuned up to give anything up to 850 horsepower, but basically the car was the same. David Brabham, John Nielsen and David Coulthard drove this car in that race and won the GT category. They were actually subsequently disqualified for some minor infringement, but the very fact of the matter is that they did actually win the category. It was a successful racing car, was the XJ220, and it had a genuine top speed of 220 miles an hour. If it hadn't been really for Walkinshaw's XJR15 with its V12 engine, which everybody wanted, the XJ220 might have been a bit more successful. Nonetheless, I think a track test of the C-Type is definitely on the cards. I know you're all saying, "Oi, that's not a Jaguar." Well, I can tell you a good reason why it almost is. Back in the early 1920s, when William Lyons was building his Swallow sidecar bodies on motorcycles, he was making enough money for him to think about putting bodies on cars. He tried to get Austin 7 chassis from Herbert Austin, but he had to buy a complete car, take the body off, and start building his beautiful Swallow bodies on those chassis. This, of course, is a fixed-head coupe, and we've got a little drop head over there. Back in the 20s, unless you were pretty rich and you could afford a Bentley, a Lagonda, a Rolls-Royce or whatever, to get it specially bodied, you were pushed to get cars bodied at the cheaper end of the scale, and that's really what William Lyons specialised in. Of course, he started making money out of the Swallow-bodied Austins, so he then went on to produce SS cars. Well, those sold successfully as well. So after the war, Jaguar was founded, and of course, the rest is history. There's something around 65 years of research and development between the Swallow-bodied cars and this XJ220. But don't you think it's really rather a wonderful story? That if these little cars hadn't have sold, then perhaps Jaguar wouldn't have existed at all. And that's why these Swallow-bodied cars, in their way, are responsible for Jaguar we know and love today. Isn't that a great story?